Hello. We are going to be reading from chapter 2 of The Mystical Marriage, and we're only going to focus on one of the texts on love, which is about the purpose of the commandments and the purpose of contemplation. And one of the cooler things about Maximus the Confessor, if you kind of some of his theology, and I don't know a lot of his theology, but something that I've learned from reading his work on the Divine Liturgy is that for Maximus, the cosmos is the whole of creation. The whole of the cosmos is created or is divided into the intelligible or the sensible realm, or maybe that's how we interpret it on earth, as intelligible or sensible. And the commandments are here to control the sensible realm, and what we do for truth and the good, which we can get through contemplation, talks about how we can reach this through the sensible realm. Through the intelligible realm. So commandments, sensible; contemplation, intelligible. And it's kind of in that way you kind of get the heaven and earth connection where we're interacting with that. So here is the chapter on love. The purpose of the commandments is to render simple our mental images of things. The purpose of reading and contemplation is to render the mind immaterial and free of mental impressions. From such a mind comes undistracted prayer. So I think when I was reading this book to start with, I think this was kind of the chapter on love that really kind of stopped me from reading it. And it was very interesting. Someone was reading it with me at the time, or we got this book around the same time, and they made it all the way through. And but this chapter on love kind of stuck me because that's kind of what I'm doing this for, is reading these to have these contemplations, kind of free the mind of mental impressions so we can have undistracted prayer. And it's interesting because you have to both follow the commandments, which we're going to talk about a lot, about following the commandments. And through this season, my mind's been on the commandments a lot. So we got to get through the commandments first, though, and then we can talk about freeing the mind of mental impressions. But we'll get there. So anyway, here's the elder. Very well, Saint Maximus. I am filled with passions, just as you say. I myself do not clearly see this, but to the extent that my mind is drawn to material things, I understand that this means that I have passions and that I am impassioned. What am I to do about this? How am I to be free of this situation? How am I to extract myself from it, to break the heavy bonds that material things have over me? In this fourth chapter, St. Maximus gives us the answer. He shifts his focus and speaks about things on a more practical level. He shows us the way we must travel in our daily lives, a way that will lead us to union with God. He presents us with the image of a person who struggles aesthetically, first and foremost with the keeping of the commandments, and second, with reading and contemplation. With the words, the purpose of the commandments, we understand a very basic way our assimilation of God's will. The commandments are manifestations of God. They are things that have been uttered by God, and thus they are extensions of God himself. They come directly from him, and to them my will must be united. Thus the purpose of the commandments is, at the very outset, my being filled with the law of God, my comprehension of God's economy of salvation, of his plan which the commandments express, reveal, and interpret. By keeping the commandments, there is a sense in which I enter into the plan of work of God himself. I walk together with him. My assimilation of God's will has a practical outcome, which we could call a moral or ethical outcome. It is in my daily life, I live as God does. I work just as he does. The Son communes unceasingly with the Father, and I commune unceasingly with the Father and the Son. My Father is still working, and I am still working, ethically applying, we might say, the commandments of God, applying whatever God does and expresses. In a very concrete way, I realize God's commandments. I work to refine their expression in my life. I administer the statutes of God. The point of departure for my life is what is just in the eyes of God, which means to give to God those things that belong to him. This is what we mean when we say we have to assimilate our will to God, to make God's will our own, because within ourselves we cannot have any other will. You often hear people say that in every moment, in every event, we must seek to discover the will of God. But such approach is rather narrow and scholastic, and in the end, it only leads to anxieties and doubts. All it does is show that the person is troubled, worried, caught up in problems, and thus at a distance from God. Our will needs to be absorbed by the will of God. When this happens, there is no agonized questioning about what God's want. I'm sorry, I'm going to start that sentence over. I'm going to start the whole paragraph over. Sorry. Our will needs to be absorbed by the will of God. When this happens, there is no agonized questioning about what God wants, because in a certain way, I am not, as it were, conditioned or colored by my own will, but I enact the will of God. And God's will is something very simple and within reach. There's no need for someone to puzzle over it, or how to recognize it, or how it should be acted on in every instance. When a person reaches this point, which is the basic point of departure for the spiritual life, then it is easy to enter the mind of the Lord. The purpose of the commandments, then, is rendering to God what belongs to God. It is, we could say, my self-identification with God, my being found together with God, with what he thinks and with what the Holy Trinity thinks together as one. The moral or ethical life, which is the concrete application of God's commandments, does not consist in, I must do this and not do that. This is forbidden, that is permitted. To the contrary, morality is essentially a fullness of a life in God, having as its basic elements the assimilation of God's will and the rendering to God of all that belongs to him, so that my work and activity are in accord with God, who is still working. The purpose of the commandments is to render simple our mental images of things. So why does Maximus say this? In previous chapters, he said that when someone prays, he must not have his thought or image in his mind, since it will immediately displace the presence of God. A thought or image, insofar as it is something that belongs to us, has a tremendous force behind it. It is something that fills us in such a way that God is not able to enter. I, therefore, have to empty my mind of every thought. However, in my everyday life, I see that my mind is filled with thoughts. What am I to do? In the first place, I must keep God's law and commandments. If I do not begin with this, I will make no progress. But this by itself does not have power to remove thoughts from my mind, which is the work and activity of divine love, although the keeping of commandments does succeed in rendering simple our mental images of things. So again, the material possessions that are the material things that our mind would bind our passions to, our connection would connect our passions to, which I think is a very interesting idea. I think it's very interesting, very closely connected to Jung's ideas of projections, and especially like projections of shadow. And you project your shadow out and hook it onto somebody else, which is something I've heard talked about before, which is a pretty good thing. As long as you're attaching your mind is attached to material things. You have these mental images that kind of draw you to. Well, the purpose of the commandments keeping the commandments is to get rid of those mental images. So those thoughts that keep reoccurring in your mind, those are there in some way, that keep reoccurring, keep kind of popping up because of something commandment-wise that you're doing. And of course, as a Christian, we're following Christ's interpretation of the commandments, which was a little different than the original the original text. If you want a great lecture on YouTube, Father Josiah Trenum on the Patristic Nectar Network has a lecture over the Ten Commandments, and it's wonderful. So we're going to finish we're going to keep talking here about the rendering simple of the mental images of things. To render simple means to reduce something to its To render simple means to reduce something to its essentials, to strip it bare of something that might normally or naturally be associated with it, like removing trees from a forest or taking away weapons from a soldier. In this context, to render simple means to take away the things, those aspects that are the source of problems for me. It means I remove from them their circumstantial power so they no longer trouble or disturb me. It is like removing the teeth from an animal so it can no longer bite you. Thus, to render simple our mental images of things means that things in the world no longer create in my mind any particular mental image or fantasies. The power of imagination, which is my capacity to fantasize, is no longer troubled or aroused by material things, because now they remain neutral, as if they were no longer seeing them in garnished colors, but in black and white. To be sure, because I am not perfect, my mind still possesses content based on the perception of these things, but I no longer feel any attraction towards them triggered by my memories or mental images associated with them. Now I live in a world of things that no longer pose a danger to me, because I no longer have within myself anything that desires the feeling of attraction to them. I am free of the power which attracted me to the things that previously appeared desirable or attractive. Again, this is not a state of purification, because if my mind were totally purified, then there would be no mental images whatsoever. But now the image that I do have in my mind no longer exerts control over me. It has been rendered simple, stripped bare of its sinful associations and powers of attraction. In this way, I've attained a certain degree of freedom from the passions, although this freedom is not yet definitive. Let us consider an example of what I mean. I see a woman, and this creates within me an image of a woman. This image can become for me the cause of temptation. If that is, it acquires an internal intensity or strength, in which case it can become an impassioned image. However, it is also possible that that image exerts no force or power within me, in which case it is a simple or mere image of a woman. This means that a simple image is, as we say, bare, because it is not clothed with the energy of the passions. It does not arise within me from impassioned depth. This is how I'm able to have thoughts about things that do not trouble me, that do not create with me in sequences of associations, good or bad. They do not injure my soul in any way. They simply pass through the mind and are gone. But most of us typically have thoughts that remain in our minds and create all kinds of conditions, moods, and feelings. By the keeping of commandments, however, and by the grace of God, I am able to only have the simple images of things, and while living in the midst of things, all the while living in the midst of things. At this point, I do not escape the thoughts altogether, but neither do I become passionately attached to them. From this, you can see the value in first practical stage of aesthetic life, which raises me up from the hell of my slavery to the things of the world around me. St. Maximus describes a second way, which also leads me to true love of God, namely the contemplative life, which consists of reading and contemplation. This life does not deny or reject the keeping of the commandments, on which it relies for its foundation. The keeping of the commandments is a first step, and one must have his foot in this step before he can progress to the level of contemplation, even though advancing from ascetic practice to contemplation is not a given, as if it were some kind of mechanical process. Ascetic practice is needed, although it is not impossible for some people to proceed directly to contemplation. The interconnection of ascetic practice and contemplation is another question. If someone wants to be a general, he's not going to get promoted to that position from the rank of corporal unless there is a war and he demonstrates extraordinary heroism, putting his life at risk and shedding his blood, and is made a general honoris causa. But such things are rare. The same is true if you want to become a saint. You're not going to get there directly from the rank of corporal, that is, from the state of rudimentary ascetic practice, since you are no longer capable of serving as a general. So you have to follow a straight path that leads to God, the path of reading and contemplation. And reading is a helpful element in the aspect of contemplation. The purpose of reading and contemplation is to render the mind immaterial and free of mental impressions. By reading is meant spiritual reading, that is, attention to spiritual concepts and ideas. Here the word reading is not connected to the idea of study, which belongs to the first stage, but it instead is connected to contemplation. It has the same meaning as the verse in the Psalms which says, "You will study the law of the Lord day and night." Here the verb study does not simply mean to read or examine or analyze, but to cultivate the spiritual sense of the text. If reading is the cultivation of spiritual meanings within the text, contemplation is the inward orientation of our spirit toward God, as well as God's response and revelation within us. It is the spiritual vision and apprehension of things. It is the very grace of God leading and guiding our spirit through the spiritual world. Spiritual reading is the human effort to know and recognize God, an activity or process that makes God known to me, that speaks to me concerning God and brings me closer to Him. But contemplation, which comes after this, is something that God Himself leads us to in response to our spiritual reading and study. Contemplation presupposes divine activity, that is, the uncreated energy of God which penetrates my mind and gives me contemplative purity and clarity, enabling me to see God. Contemplation is thus the inner experiential knowledge and recognition of God. I can exert, for example, that God is a Trinity, and I can try to demonstrate this using one kind of philosophy or another. I can be an excellent dogmatic theologian and yet have absolutely no inner or spiritual understanding or awareness of what I'm talking about. Another person, however, can speak to you about God's Trinity based on what he has seen or heard because he experiences God inwardly. He has been illumined and informed directly by God and not from books or articles. This inward assurance from God, this revelation of God Himself to a human person is contemplation. As a rule, when we speak of contemplative life, we do not absolutely identify it with contemplation, but give it a broader significance since we understand it to refer to the way of life that leads to contemplation. When I come to know God through spiritual reading, I come to know first and foremost the things around or about God. But when God Himself appears and encounters me and makes my spirit touch the marks of the nails, by which I mean the signs of the divine economy of salvation, illumined by the brilliant light of the Trinity. Then I enter into a personal relation with him, and it is in them that my mind becomes immaterial and free of mental impressions, unburdened by all of its weight. What are the things that weigh on the mind? Let's suppose I have a problem or something is troubling me. I visit a monastery, but no one greets me with warmth or affection. No one says, "Welcome, Father, we are happy to see you." I imagine I have come on a bad day, or they're busy with things, or maybe they're tired, or maybe, and because of this, they offer me only the most standard kind of reception. Then my mind starts thinking, what am I doing here? Who knows what these people think of me? Perhaps they don't even want to be here. Maybe they see me as some kind of burden. But who am I anyway? I am not anybody they should notice or care about. I'm not worthy of their time or attention. So what am I doing here? I'll just leave. The mind grows very weary carrying these kinds of weights. You've noticed, I'm sure, that what you're like when you're burdened with a problem or when something is weighing on your mind. You become downcast, heavy, sluggish, your head aches, and your heart can experience palpitations. Your stomach gets upset. It's like you've been struck in the mind and the heart. Conversely, the way of spiritual reading and contemplation makes the mind immaterial, as Maximus says, removing every burden and weight that has become attached to it, making it pure and receptive of God, and free from mental impressions. This path does not simply remove from the mind whatever has become attached to it, but whatever has entered into it. It makes it formless, removes the forms and shapes and images that have been impressed and imprinted deeply within it, so that the mind becomes simple, bare, empty of every thought and image, so that it can now contain God. As we said moments ago, the keeping of the commandments does not remove the mental images, but it does make them simple, free of sinful inclinations, free of temptations, and free of passions. To be sure, both of these ways are proper to the monastic life, but the first way, the keeping of the commandments, is especially appropriate to those living in the world. Keeping the commandments, one could say, pulls a person out of the mud, but it does not remove the stains and dirt that remain. But such people can nonetheless live in the world in the midst of money, possessions, a wife, children, so on, and without any of these things being occasion for sin. The monk lives a different life. He does not have a wife. He does not have money. He does not hold personal possessions. And so is in a position to progress through the spiritual reading and contemplation, because being free of worldly cares and burdens, the monk is free to fly to heaven. But we must want to do this. Otherwise, even if he has wings, he will remain on the ground. At most, he might jump a little bit into the air, but gravity will still bring him back to earth. From such a mind comes undistracted prayer. Because spiritual reading and contemplation make the mind immaterial and free of mental images, which is to say that they empty the mind, they grant the gift of undistracted prayer, and through this, the love of God. Contemplation is not a matter of fantasies or dreams, but inward illumination, a downpour of grace that falls upon the mind and overwhelms it. If then you want to pray without distraction, you have to follow this path. Don't focus on things or what you're doing or what you've achieved or what you think you achieved or what lies ahead or what happened or what didn't happen. Instead, proceed immediately to the point of departure, to the knowledge of God, namely spiritual reading and contemplation. These alone will guide you in undistracted prayer, which will come to you by itself. It will be given to you by the grace of God. When this happens, I will understand inwardly and experientially that grace is a gift from God, because what I could have never achieved on my own, even with thousands of struggles, I suddenly find present and operative within me. Who placed this gracious gift within me? I did not have it. It's not something that I achieved, nor was it possible for me to achieve it. How did this happen? This is the mind's revelation when confronted with the event of divine grace. of God's gift and charism. In other words, suddenly I realize that I have become a bearer of God's grace, but in such a way that I understand that what I now have is something I received. And having received it, I make it my own, even though it is not mine but God's. The element of pride and self-conceit is absent here, because I know that what has been given to me belongs to God. Grace brings with it this kind of assurance and security. Whatever I might be able to accomplish through my own efforts will never be able to perfect or complete. It will all be marked by corruption and death, for at any moment I can fall from the place to which I had risen. This happens to the extent that I think I am the one who brought about this work, or that I attained something, and because I believe it to be mine, I can easily lose it because of my pride and ego. But with the gift of grace, I perceive that God has given this to me, that I discovered within myself quite by surprise. I found it placed within me. In the same way the evil one comes at night, sows his tares, and you find them in the morning, so too does the great God come when the night covers all things. That is, when you are covered by ignorance. He places the gift of grace in you, and you see that you are rich, even though you yourself are poor and have nothing. After this, St. Maximus continues to develop his thought, saying, the way of the ascetic practice does not suffice by itself for the perfect liberation of the mind from the passions, so that it might be able to pray without distraction, unless such practice is succeeded by various spiritual contemplations. Ascetic practice frees the mind only from licentiousness and hate, while spiritual contemplations rid it of both forgetfulness and ignorance. And in this way, the mind will finally be able to pray as it ought. That's where we're going to end tonight. We'll pick up with those last two paragraphs that I read were more chapters on love. So we'll recap a little bit next time and then add more to it.